To the rest of our town, we were the Mercer family. Old money, good name, the kind of people whose photos end up in the local paper at charity galas. My father ran the largest private grain transport operation in southern Alberta, and growing up, I thought that meant something. I thought it meant we were solid, rooted, safe. I was 22 when I found out exactly how wrong I was. It started the night my grandfather died. My grandfather. Everyone called him Pop. Even people who weren't related to him, passed away in early November, in the middle of a snowstorm so bad that the highway between Lethbridge and Fort Macleod closed for 2 days. He went quietly, the way he'd lived, without making a fuss, without asking anyone for anything. The hospice nurse called my father first. My father didn't call me until the following morning, and only because I happened to phone him first. That detail lodged itself in my chest and never quite left. Pop had lived alone for the last decade of his life on a small acreage outside Coaldale, a place he bought long before the town grew up around it. He'd farmed barley for 30 years, then retired, then spent his final years doing what he always loved, fixing old engines in a workshop behind his house, feeding his neighbor's horses over the fence, writing long letters by hand to people I'd never met. He was the kind of man who knew the names of things. The names of clouds, the names of grasses, the names of every kid on the street, even the ones who'd grown up and moved away. He and my father did not get along. I never fully understood why when I was young. I saw it the way a child sees adult tension, as weather, as something that happened around you without explanation. My father would go quiet when Pop's name came up. Pop would get a look in his eyes when my father walked into the room. Not anger, exactly. More like the look you give a wound you've learned to stop picking at. I was close to Pop in the way that second-generation distances sometimes create. My father pushed me toward accounting, toward practicality, toward the business. Pop taught me to change my own oil, to read a sky before a storm, to play cribbage badly but cheerfully. We talked on the phone every Sunday until I was in university, and then less often after that, and then, as adult life has a way of doing, less often still. I regret that now more than I can properly say. The will reading happened 10 days after the funeral. My father handled all of it. Arranged the lawyer, arranged the time, arranged everything the way he arranged things, which was to say completely and without asking anyone else's opinion. I drove in from Calgary, where I was renting a basement suite and working for a mid-size logistics firm. My younger brother, who was still in school in Edmonton, couldn't get away. It was just me and my father and my aunt. My father's younger sister, who'd flown in from Vancouver, sitting in a law office on Mayor Magrath Drive, while a man in a gray suit read us the terms of my grandfather's estate. The house and the acreage went to my aunt. That was expected. The equipment, the tools, the truck, split between a few old neighbors and the local agricultural society. Pop had apparently arranged this years ago. Everyone nodded. Then the lawyer paused and looked up from the document and said there was one remaining item. A separate letter, sealed, addressed to me by name. Not to my father, not to the estate collectively. To me, specifically, with instructions that it be delivered privately after the reading concluded. My father's expression didn't change. That was how I knew it was bad. He had a particular stillness he went to when something caught him off guard. A flatness in the face. A deliberate absence of reaction, the way a man looks when he's calculating. I'd grown up reading that face the way other people read weather. And the moment the lawyer said my name, my father went still. The lawyer handed me the envelope after my father and aunt left the room. It was cream-colored, business-sized, sealed with actual wax, dark green, with a small impression that looked like a compass rose. Pop's handwriting on the front, my full name, nothing else. Inside was a single key and a letter, 2 pages, written in that careful, slightly cramped cursive that I associated Sunday afternoon phone calls and the smell of his workshop. "I'm going to ask you to trust me one more time," he wrote. "There's a storage locker in Picture Butte. Unit 14. The key is for the padlock. I changed it last spring, so don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't go with your father. Don't tell him about this letter. Go alone, or take someone you trust completely. What's inside will explain everything I was never brave enough to say while I was alive. I'm sorry it took me this long. I should have done this years ago. You deserved better, and so did your brother, and I'll carry that with me wherever I'm going. I love you, son. You were always the best of what that family could have been. I stood in the parking lot of that law office for a long time. The November wind was coming off the prairie flat and mean, the kind of cold that gets into your collar and stays there. I didn't cry. I don't fully know why. I think I was too busy trying to understand what I was holding. My father found me before I reached my car. He didn't ask about the letter directly. He never asked about things directly. That wasn't how he operated. He said he hoped I understood that Pop's final years had involved some cognitive decline, that the old man had developed some eccentric ideas near the end, that if I found anything in the estate that seemed unusual or that raised questions, the right thing to do was to bring it to him first. As a family, he said, we handle things as a family. He put his hand on my shoulder when he said it. The way he always did when he wanted me to understand something wasn't a suggestion. I told him I understood. I drove to Picture Butte the following morning. It's a small town, maybe 1,000 people, a grain elevator, a hockey rink, the kind of place that exists in southern Alberta as a fact of geography rather than a destination. The storage facility was on the north edge of town, a row of metal door units behind a chain-link fence. Unit 14 was near the end, slightly larger than the others. The padlock was exactly as Pop had described. The key turned on the first try. I don't know what I was expecting. Something small, maybe. A box of papers. Some sentimental objects he hadn't wanted my father to distribute. What I found was a workshop in miniature. He'd set it up over years, I realized later. A folding table, a lamp on a long extension cord, a small space heater in the corner. On the table, a banker's box, neatly labeled. Beside it, a laptop, an old one, plugged into a portable battery pack, and a USB drive taped to the side with a strip of masking tape. On the tape in his handwriting, "Start here." The USB drive contained a single folder. Inside that folder, 462 documents. I sat in that storage unit on a folding chair in the November cold, with a space heater clicking beside me, and I read for 3 hours without stopping. My grandfather had been meticulous in a way I hadn't known about. Meticulous and patient and, I understood by the end of those 3 hours, quietly furious for a very long time. The documents were a record, a careful, chronological, sourced record of what my father had done over 20 years of running the family business. It started small, the way these things always do, I think. Inflated mileage claims. Equipment depreciated twice. A cousin bought out of a minority partnership stake at a price that bore no relationship to the actual value of what he was signing away. I recognized the cousin's name. I'd met him once at a family barbecue when I was maybe 12. He'd been friendly and then, apparently, he'd been gone. It got larger. My father had, over the course of his tenure running Mercer Grain Transport, systematically defrauded 3 separate business partners. One was a farmer cooperative out of Tabor that had entered a long-term hauling contract with the company. My father had pocketed the federal rural transport subsidy that was supposed to offset their rates while continuing to charge them full price. One was a childhood friend who had invested his entire retirement savings, $240,000, into a supposed expansion of the fleet. The expansion had never happened. The money had gone into an account my father controlled personally, and the friend had eventually signed a settlement agreement that Pop's files strongly suggested had been obtained under duress. The third was the most serious. A land deal involving a parcel of acreage near Picture Butte. Ironically, near the very facility where I was sitting that my father had helped broker, then manipulated the title transfer on, in a way that had cost the original owner the property entirely. That third one was criminal. Not morally criminal, actually criminal. Pop had even found the relevant section of the Criminal Code of Canada and printed it out. Fraud over $5,000. He'd underlined it. The banker's box contained the physical copies, contracts, bank statements, photographs of documents that should have existed and didn't. A series of handwritten notes my grandfather had taken during conversations with the people my father had wronged. Notes he'd apparently been taking for years, quietly, without telling anyone. At the bottom of the box was another envelope. This one contained a name and phone number, a lawyer in Lethbridge who specialized in financial fraud, and, according to the sticky note Pop had attached, knows about this already, at least the basics. I spoke to him in September. He's expecting your call if you decide to move forward. If you decide not to, I understand. This is your decision, not mine. I only wish I'd given it to you sooner. I sat with that for a long time. I want to be honest about what those hours felt like because it's easy to tell this kind of story as if the choice was obvious. As if I sat down, read the evidence, and stood up knowing exactly what I was going to do. It wasn't like that. My father was still my father. The business had paid for my education, or at least, it had paid for the veneer of my education, which I now understood might have been financed by money that belonged to other people. The family name was the only name I had, and the people my grandfather had documented, the farmer cooperative, the retired friend, the landowner, they were strangers to me. Real people, I understood that, people who had been genuinely hurt, but strangers. I drove back to Calgary and didn't sleep. I called my brother that night. I told him I'd found something and that I needed him to come to Calgary as soon as he could. He heard something in my voice, because he didn't ask questions. He just said he'd get on a bus in the morning. My father called me twice that week. Both times, he mentioned casually that he hoped I wasn't getting into the weeds on Pop's paperwork, that the old man had been not entirely himself in his final years, and that the estate was being wrapped up and there was nothing that needed my attention. Both times, I told him I understood. Both times, I said very little else. My brother arrived on a Thursday. He was 20, studying environmental science, and he had Pop's same quality of stillness. Not my father's calculated stillness, but something gentler, something that just waited. I walked him through everything in the storage unit. He read for a long time without speaking. When he was done, he looked up and said, "We have to call that lawyer." I'd known that was the answer. I think I'd needed to hear someone else say it. The lawyer in Lethbridge. A woman about my grandfather's age, practical and unimpressed with nonsense in a way that reminded me of Pop almost painfully, had already reviewed the summary my grandfather had given her. She walked us through it for 2 hours. She explained the relevant statutes. She explained what the process would look like. She also told us something Pop had apparently not known about, or had known and not mentioned. Because some of the fraud involved federal subsidy programs, there was a formal whistleblower reporting mechanism, and under certain conditions, the people who provided the information could be eligible for a portion of any penalties recovered. I hadn't thought about that. I want to be clear about that. I hadn't gone into that storage unit, thinking about what I would get out of it. But I won't pretend I didn't feel something when she said it. Relief, maybe. The knowledge that doing the right thing wasn't going to leave my brother and me with nothing. We filed the formal complaint in December. My father found out in January. He did not find out through the legal process. He found out because he called me on a Tuesday evening and there was something different in his voice. A flatness I hadn't heard before, more absolute than his usual calculation, and he said that he knew what I'd done, and he wanted me to understand what that meant for our relationship, and for my position in the family. He didn't shout. My father never shouted. He just said these things in that level voice, and then he said that I was no longer welcome at the property, or at any family event, or in any context that bore the Mercer name, and that if I chose to continue down this path, I would be doing it alone. I said, "I know." He said, "Then we're finished." I said, "I think we were finished a long time ago. I just didn't know it yet." I don't know if he expected me to argue. He hung up before I could say anything else. My brother had been sitting across the kitchen table from me while this was happening. I put the phone down and looked at him. He looked back. "We good?" he said. "We're good," I said. "It took 14 months. The RCMP's commercial crime unit got involved in March. The farmer cooperative had kept their own records. Incomplete, but enough. The retired investor had never actually cashed the settlement check because, as it turned out, he hadn't believed for a single day that it was legitimate. And he'd waited a long time for someone to show up with better evidence. The land case took longer because it required a title audit and 3 separate hearings, but the original owner was still alive and had documentation that aligned precisely with what Pop had gathered. My father's lawyer filed 4 motions to have the case dismissed. None of them worked. My aunt flew back from Vancouver and called me twice, once to say that she thought I was wrong, and once, 6 months later, to say she thought I was probably right, but that she wished I'd handled it differently. I understand that. Family is complicated. She's not a bad person. She just loved her brother more than she loved the truth, for a long time, and that's a very human thing to do. The hearing was in February of the following year. I wasn't required to testify. The documentary evidence was so complete that the Crown didn't need us on the stand. Pop had been thorough in a way that I think only someone who has spent 30 years watching something wrong happen, slowly, over time, and not knowing how to stop it. Only that kind of person documents things that carefully. He'd known, I think, that when he finally handed it over, it had to be undeniable. It had to be the kind of evidence that didn't require anyone to take anyone's word for it. I sat in the gallery with my brother and the lawyer. My father stood at the front of the courtroom in a suit I recognized. He'd worn it to my university graduation and entered his plea. The room was not full. These things rarely are. The farmer cooperative had sent a representative. The retired investor was there in person, a man in his late 60s, with a very straight back and very steady hands, and when the plea was entered he closed his eyes for a moment and then opened them again, and that was all. My father did not look at me. I'd wondered, going in, if he would. I'd prepared myself for both possibilities. But he didn't look at the gallery at all. He looked straight ahead and said what his lawyer had arranged for him to say, and then it was over, and people began to gather their things, and my brother put his hand on my arm and said quietly that he wanted to get coffee and get out. We got coffee and got out. There's a particular thing that happens after you do something that costs you a family. People expect you to feel relief, or anger, or maybe grief in a tidy shape that you can point to. What I felt was mostly just space, a lot of empty space where something used to be. I'd grown up assuming my father was a certain kind of person, that the business was a certain kind of thing, that the Mercer name meant something solid. And now I knew what it actually meant and where it had actually come from, and none of it was solid. None of it had ever been solid, but Pop had known what it meant to build something honest. He'd farmed 30 years on that Coaldale acreage and never once taken from anyone who hadn't agreed to give. He'd sat in that storage unit, quietly, over years, gathering evidence of the thing he couldn't stop, waiting for the right moment and the right person to give it to. And when he did, he addressed the envelope to me, in his careful handwriting, with a compass rose pressed into the wax. He knew me well enough to know I'd open it. My brother and I don't use the Mercer name now for the business we're building. We registered it under our middle names instead, Webb and Cole, which sounds like a law firm, and is actually a small freight consultancy that we're running out of a shared office space in Calgary. We specialize in transparent contract structures for agricultural haulers. We work mostly with cooperatives and independent operators. We're not making much money yet. We're making some. The whistleblower process concluded 8 months after sentencing. The financial penalties were substantial. The recovery wasn't everything that had been taken. It never is. But the cooperative received restitution, and the retired investor received more than he'd originally lost, with interest, and the land case was settled in a way that the original owner described, when I spoke to him briefly on the phone, as better than I expected after this long. We received a portion. I put most of mine in an RRSP. My brother used his to finish school without debt. Those are not dramatic things to do with money. They are the right things. Pop's storage unit is cleared out now. The folding table, the lamp, the space heater. I kept them. They're in my apartment in a corner of the living room, and they look slightly out of place there, which is fine. Some things are supposed to remind you of where they came from. On the wall above them, I hung a cribbage board. Wooden, old, hand-painted, the kind you don't find anymore. He'd made it himself sometime in the 80s, and it sat on a shelf in his workshop for as long as I could remember. I can't play cribbage well. I never could. He used to beat me cheerfully and thoroughly every single time, and then make tea and talk about whatever was on his mind. And those were some of the best hours of my life, and I didn't understand that until he was gone. I understand it now. The greatest thing my grandfather left me wasn't the evidence. And it wasn't the money. It wasn't even the key in that cream-colored envelope. It was the understanding that you can know something is wrong for a long time and still find the courage to say so, that it's never too late, and that the right person to give the truth to is the one who will actually use it. I hope I'm that person. I'm trying to be. That's all any of us can do, I think.